Who here would like to continue today with some good news? What a surprise, most of you. The good news is that if you would like to boost the success of Dynamics, CRM, ERP, Power Platform projects, and in fact other technology projects, because the vast majority of what I'll be talking about applies far, far more widely than Dynamics 365, you are in the right place. But before we get into the 7 C's of Dynamics 365 training, a little about me. I'm Gill Walker, and I've possibly travelled, with the exception of my videographer husband at the back there, further to this conference than the rest of the room put together. The last 22 years I have called Sydney home, so that's 10,500 miles away. For most of that time, I've been playing with Microsoft CRM, Microsoft Dynamics CRM, Microsoft Dynamics 365, Microsoft Power Platform, you know, same thing, different name a lot of the time, constantly evolving. I first cut my teeth on 1.0 beta. It makes me smile when I see people standing up and they say, I'm really experienced with Dynamics. I use CRM 2016. Okay. So I've been working in that space. Overall, I regard myself as an educator. That means I am helping people learn more about the platform in lots and lots of different ways. That includes training, speaking, mentoring, but I also do a lot of consulting. And I use that consulting as a way of illustrating a lot of what I talk about. You will probably hear some stories from my consultancy as we go through today. If you're interested in contact, I've got all the usual details there at the bottom. Anyway, without our sponsors, all of the education and information and learning that these conferences provide wouldn't happen. So I would like to thank Microsoft, our event sponsor, HSO, Proximo 3, Docs42, PwC, Applied Information Sciences, and of course, these other people here. We really should thank these people, as without them, it is not possible. The 7 sins of Dynamics 365 training. But before I introduce you to the specific 7 sins, and more importantly, show you how you can overcome them. After all, there is no point just saying, well, that's wrong, and that's wrong, and that's wrong. Here, we're all about success, so I will show you how you can overcome them. Before we get to that, I would like to talk to you briefly about project success, and before that, project failure. So I would like to ask you, in the world of CRM, and I'm talking way bigger than Dynamics, I'm talking CRM across the board, and there are about 400 technologies out there that claim to be a CRM technology. So within those projects, what do you think the perceived failure rate is? Any idea?
70%.
You go 70? 80? 80? You go 85?
I didn't realise mine was optimistic.
75 maybe.
It is up there. And as professionals in that space, knowing that we have that sort of perceived failure rate, that does not make me feel good. And I really think as a profession at large, we should be looking at what can we do. So this is just showing you a little bit about the failure rate, and it is actually closer to 85%. It does depend on what you read, and there's a wide range of possible answers. Some go as low as 19, some go higher than 85. But overall, I think from a lot of reading and bringing things together, we are looking at about an 85% failure rate. So why? Yeah, this is just flagging the difference in the rates that you might get. So we've got a range of different surveys that have been done showing the failure rate as per that survey. Now these were all done pre-2015 because this particular review of the literature that I pulled out was done in 2015. Sometimes when I put this up, people say, but Dynamics is so much better, and since 2015 we've got this technical feature, we've got that, we've got Agile, we've got, it's not relevant. In fact, the 2019 Digital Transformation Survey said that we've got similar failure rates. We've also got between 51 and 54% of projects, when they go live, their organisation experiences some form of major operational upset. That might be inability to raise invoices, inability to ship goods, inability to make and record calls. Obviously it varies, but it would be fair to say it is something that has a massive effect on the bottom line of the companies in question, and probably on their customers. We've also got an increase in cost of between 50 and 300%. So keeping the numbers relatively simple, if we had a £100,000 project, that means that the final cost of that project isn't £100,000 as we quoted. It is somewhere between, if you're lucky, £150,000 and £400,000. Change the unit, take the numbers up, take the numbers down, doesn't really matter. But if you're that implementing organisation, you're not happy. So going back to that range of surveys and doing a similar review of the reasons given for failure, this is the sort of things that we see. I'm not going to go through all of them, but lacking in functionality, well, over budget shouldn't be a surprise given the numbers I gave you a moment ago. Inflexible, poor performance, difficult to learn, too time consuming. And I would argue that the majority of those could be possibly completely fixed, certainly improved if we improved the education and training part of the project. And that's what I'm here primarily to talk about, give you some tips as to how you can improve your project by boosting the education and training that is throughout that project. Just to make sure that you're not sitting on your laurels at the moment and saying, oh, but that all is old data, that's from 10, 20, 30 years ago. This lot was from a survey done about, well, I think it's probably 2 years old now. I first used it in a presentation last year. And in another presentation, I've analysed all of these reasons, and 80% of them, when you drill into them, come down to a lack of understanding somewhere in the project. And of course, the one way to overcome a lack of understanding is to boost education. In fact, it is probably the only way to overcome that lack of understanding. Now, I am going to introduce you to the 7 C's of Dynamics 365 training and show you how we can overcome. Before we move into meeting my 7 friends, another question for you people. Why is training or education important? Whether it's as part of a project, part of career progression, part of a wide range of things. Why is it important? Any ideas? It does boost understanding and therefore reduces failure rate and broadens skills. Anyone else any thoughts?
Make them think about the processes as they go through the training and how that fits with the training.
Yeah.
Increase engagement.
Yes. It's certainly good quality training will certainly boost end user engagement, and that, as I introduce my 7, well, I shouldn't call them friends because they're not, they're troublemakers really. As I introduce them, you will see why, and you'll get some ideas as to how we can improve our training. So the first of the 7 sins that I'm going to introduce you to is lust. And when he gets in the way of our training, we deliver training on something like dynamics that doesn't include practical. Now let's face it, using Dynamics 365, in fact using any software, is an inherently practical exercise. The whole reason for doing the implementation will be to help people do their role in some way, shape or form. And yet, there are people out there who think we can just do a quick demo, you click here, you do this, you type that, da 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 da, bang, you know it all now, don't you? Fine, off you go. And next week or sometime later, we'll meet that sin a little bit later on, you'll remember everything I've said and you'll be able to do it in your job. So to keep lust at bay, we absolutely must include practical in our training, but not any old practical. We should give people step-by-step instructions that they can follow, and as the training moves through, we shouldn't be repeating those steps. We should be making them more slimmed down so that users are recalling what they've learned earlier. The key thing to remember when you're designing this training, and you probably, as the designer, will likely remember it, but you as the trainer or the training manual or whatever is not going to be around when those people first start using the skills that you've taught them in their life. So it is important during the training that you wean people off those step-by-step instructions. If they're having to constantly reach for the training manual, and where was that? Yeah, okay, oh, but it's not quite as we did in the lab, so now I've got to think, as they're trying to transition your training to their world, it's not going to work, and of course then we're going to get, it's too hard, it's too complicated, my Excel spreadsheet or whatever I did previously was much simpler, back to old ways of working, and we have a failure. Envy. Envy is getting in the way when all we're thinking about in our training is exam passes. And we're designing training that is purely based on exam content. In other words, we are not thinking about the people in the course. Training that is targeted for exam passes is great when the audience wants to do the exams and pass them. But it's not great when that's just the course that we found and it looked vaguely okay, and we're giving it to other people who've got a completely different aim and reason for learning the material in question. So to keep envy at bay, what we need to do is understand who we are training, what are their needs, and how do we meet those needs with our training. This is the one that gets in the way when we're really not focused on our real participants in the training. Anger gets in the way when we confuse our participants. And that usually happens when we are not focused on the role of those participants. So perhaps we do very generic training and then we send people back to do their job, and we expect them to make the bridge from the training that they've listened to their world. It is not the participant's job to translate training to their world. It is our job as the training providers, designers, planners, whatever, to make the training fit the participants' needs. And that usually, therefore, means doing a lot more training. We can't just say, right, we've got a dynamics rollout, so we'll do some dynamics training. Because you've probably got people in a large number of different roles, all with slightly different needs, and it is our responsibility to make the training fit each of those, not a one-size-fits-all. I think one-size-fits-all often works out as actually one-size-fits-none. Pride. This one is a real problem when he comes to visit. And this comes out, or he, she comes to visit, when we don't acknowledge the importance of using trainers. In other words, we don't acknowledge that training in and of itself is a skill. In other words, we think, oh fine, you know dynamics, you've been working on the project for a while, I think you're free next week, we've got some training running, you can do it, can't you? I've seen that happen surprisingly often. People pulled out of a desk job, pulled out of a technical job, told where the training room is, and there they are. And that's where we get people who just read slides, for example. And of course that assumes that there's enough material on the slides for them to read, which is probably leading into another problem as well, if they can read the slides. Because there's probably far too much material on the slides. So to keep pride at bay, we need to use people to deliver the training who for sure know the content, but also know how to communicate to a range of people with different learning preferences, different learning styles. And as we heard this morning, possibly people with some of those hidden disabilities. I vividly remember a training session I gave before I moved to Sydney, so we're probably looking at about 25 years ago. And it was a basic desktop rollout training in, let's say, 97, 96, something like that. And there was one person in the group who was, to say he was staring at me would be an understatement, but it was real, absolute stare. And I got really quite nervous. At risk of stating the obvious, I was 20-something years younger than I am now, 20-something years less experience than I have now, and I've got these eyes just boring holes in me. And I moved around so that I could go to the back of the room, watch what was going on people's screen, so on and so forth. And after the session, I asked, and I got told that that person was deaf and was desperately trying to lip read. Now, if I'd been told that like 4 hours earlier, I could have accommodated him. But the best trainers in the world can't accommodate for issues, disabilities, whatever, that you don't know about. I mean, to a degree you can, but you can do it a whole heap better if people tell you, this afternoon you will have somebody who needs to lip read. This morning you've got someone who's got visual problems. Why not share that information with the trainer? You probably get some garbage about confidentiality and so on. Gluttony. Gluttony gets in the way when we schedule the training at the wrong time. In other words, we allow the project plan or availability of resources to take precedence over the people that we're trying to train. I'm helping a client in Western Australia at the moment, and until I got involved in the project, they thought they could run end-user training 6 weeks before go live. How much do you remember of, assuming you even did one, but let's imagine you went to a lecture 6 weeks ago, and I now come and grill you about what was in it, what did they say, what did you learn? And yet we expect people to go to training, which after all, we as the employing organisation, the project team and so on, we're heavily invested in it. A lot of the participants, particularly in end user training, are just doing their job. They come to work because they have to. They're often not heavily invested in it. And yet we think we can run an end user session and go live 6 weeks later, and they will be able to recall what they've learned and apply that to their role. So to keep gluttony at bay, we should schedule the training at an appropriate time. And I personally believe you should never do end user training more than 2 weeks prior to go live. Now, that is sort of based on my experience. I would actually say shorter is better, but I think you can probably get away with 2 weeks. And if you choose your groups appropriately, people who do training today and then don't actually start using the application until 2 weeks today can probably cope. But I would go shorter if I could. But in an ideal world, and in small businesses, which is where I do a lot of work, I will do my end user training the day prior to go live, or even the morning of. So I have, where I've had some nice small groups, I've been able to do training in the morning, do the various switchover bits at lunchtime, and go live that afternoon, and that gives really good results. I think that should be your target, but acknowledging that it's one of those targets you can very rarely meet, but nevertheless aim for it as close as possible. Greed. This is another one really where the project plan is taking precedence over the users, who should after all be the most important consideration for all. And this is when we try and condense the training. So we acknowledge that we've got to teach this amount of material, but it's a bit hard, our people are busy, we can't afford that much, so we'll do it in half an hour instead. And again, we then wonder why. So to keep him at bay, what we want to aim for is training that is long enough to allow people to do what they need to do, including the practical, including Q&A, including whatever else is necessary for those people, whoever they are, to learn how to use the software in their role. And our final sin is sloth, and when he comes to roost, fundamentally we just don't do training at all. And that's when, oh dear, we've run out of budget, we've run out of time, we've got to go live on Monday, we've only just done the data migration, fine, we'll go live anyway, and people can just muddle through. So, as you can see, that one really does not work. So having looked briefly at the 7 sins, I'd now like to look at what training is required in a successful CRM project. Often, when I'm talking to my clients about the training in a CRM project, they only think about end user training. But I think there is a lot more training required if we want the project as a whole to be one of the 15% rather than the 85% that we mentioned earlier. So if we look at a typical project, and it could be CRM, it could be a wide range of other things, and I'm looking at one chunk of that project. So whether we're talking agile, waterfall, something in between, that's not relevant as far as this is concerned, but we've got a chunk of a project with, at the end of it, a go live. So we are rolling something out to our users. Typically, you will always have those 4, I'm going to use the word phases, but they're not actually phases. There'll be those 4 areas of activity. And there is some training / education that we should look at in each of those areas. So when we look at the scoping and design part of this piece of the project, what I believe is really important is what I call envisioning education. That will often be targeting people, the decision makers within the client organisation, and it will show them what the technology can do before we make any changes. That makes your whole scoping and your design a whole heap easier, because you're not constantly reinventing the wheel and explaining to this individual, to that individual, what you've already got, and demonstrating how that can meet a particular need, because you've run that up front. If we look at the implementation phase, we will have a number of people, maybe people from outside, probably some people from outside of the organisation, quite likely also some people from inside the organisation, involved in various bits of the implementation. We should make sure that everybody who is involved in the implementation knows what they need to know in order to do their bit of the project well. Often when I say that to a client, they will come up with, but we brought in a third party, they're a gold partner, they're this, they're that. Making those assumptions is really, really dangerous. Because yes, maybe that third party with whatever logos and so on should have done the training. But if they haven't, who is the one that bears the consequences of them failing to have delivered or failing to provide appropriately skilled people? So, as I like to say, assumptions or assuming makes an ass of you and me. And in this area, it definitely comes out. With testing, we're probably bringing in end users to do some of the testing. We need to make sure that people know how to test. I've been into clients and I've organised testing sessions, and all that happens is, I don't like it like this. It would be better if it was pink. It would be better if it was some other way. Whereas it's essential that the people doing the testing know what they're testing, know how to test. So we need to educate them if they don't already know that. And then of course with Go Live we've got our end user training, which usually gets onto the project plan, but when Sloth comes to visit, it doesn't get executed as well as it should. So we're now going back and looking at the original reasons that that 2015 survey came up with for projects failing. One of the reasons given is that CRM, and so we have to assume doing a role using this new CRM, is too time consuming. It was quicker the old way, whatever that means. I think that one will often come down to a failure in education in a few different areas. That might come about because an end user in question, the person who's saying this CRM doesn't work, it takes too long, hasn't been trained properly. It may also come about because there's been some other education missing earlier. So we've now got a process that we've implemented that doesn't work for the users in question because we didn't take best advantage of the technology, or we didn't use all of these skills to make sure that it works for the users in question. Well, it's difficult to learn. I think that one is reasonably obvious because we really shouldn't be leaving our end users to just fiddle their way through the software for themselves. So if we've done our end user training correctly, and of course we've got a good implementation, this one should never get off the drawing board. Poor performance, again, there's a number of reasons why that could come about, and some of them do come down to a lack of understanding of the technology, how to implement it, what's good for a particular problem, and so on. Inflexible, that's probably an issue with end user training, that somebody has got an idea into their head that you should do it this way, whatever it is, and in the new technology it's done differently, so we've probably got an issue with the end user training. Doesn't integrate well, well again, what are we integrating to and why? Have we shown people how to use the software? Over budget, well that's one where how on earth, or how did we come up with the original 100,000, to use the example I used earlier, number, and how did we let it get to some number bigger than that? Poor support, we've probably got a lacking of education and training in our support people, combined with the need for support, also often points to poor end user training and lacking in functionality. The visually unappealing, that's probably just it would be better pink. But so for successful training that really adds to the success of your project, you want to include practical with step-by-step instructions that people can use and leave the skills in the minds of the end users. We should focus our training on the needs of the participants, not the project plan, not the management, not a wide range of other people, but the people in the training should be the ones that we focus on, right the way through the planning, the design, and the execution of training. We should make sure that we're always training with people who can communicate to all of those different learning styles. A question that I include when I'm doing train the trainer is, who is the one person that you can guarantee will not be in a session that you are facilitating? And the answer is you, because you are facilitating. And yet, so many people deliver training as though the only person in the audience was them. So they deliver training that speaks to their learning needs, their ways of understanding, and not to the wide range of other people who need to learn this software. We also need to run training at appropriate times and giving it long enough for people to learn. And of course, our final friend, him half asleep on the couch there, we do need to include training. And with that, I would like to once again thank our sponsors, all of these people who have made today possible, and I would love to keep in touch with anybody who is interested. I have written a number of e-books about various aspects of CRM, not all dynamics, some of them are general CRM. That particular one is about an area of Dynamics 365 that is hideously misused in many projects. I've been involved in a lot of rescues where the product catalogue has been somewhere between vandalised and completely ignored, and never to the benefit of the project or the end users. So if you would like that, please get in touch, tell me you would like it, and I will organise for you to get it. So that brings us to the end of the 7 sins of Dynamics 365 training, or technology training, IT training, probably quite a lot of other training.